What is an elegy poem? An elegy is a type of poem that mourns the loss of someone or something. It's like a sad song in words, expressing feelings of sorrow, grief, and reflection. These poems often talk about death, but they can also honor and remember a person or even a way of life that's gone. Most elegies tend to focus on mourning the death of individuals, often reflecting on themes of loss, mortality, and the passage of time. Think of them as heartfelt letters written to say goodbye. Elegies usually stir up a cocktail of emotions. Readers often feel a mix of sadness and reflection, as these poems are centered around loss and mourning. There's a sense of deep empathy for the loss being described. But there's also a touch of beauty and peace. Elegies can transform grief into something eloquent and profound. Think of them like bittersweet melodies that linger with a tinge of melancholy. While it's not required for a person to have experienced certain situations in order to write an elegy, I'm sure most authors write from things they have witnessed firsthand. In this video I'll cover the ones I found on the internet. If I left any out that you feel should be mentioned, feel free to leave a comment. In famous elegy poems, poets often weave in personal stories and broader reflections. These poems go beyond just telling a story. They delve into the emotions and philosophical questions that arise. From encountering death and loss, the concept of elegy poems dates back to ancient times, with roots in Greek and Roman literature. One of the earliest known elegies is the Iliad by Homer, which includes elegiac elements mourning the death of heroes like Hector. The Iliad may be a compilation of various oral tales, and much of the narration may describe Greek life and warfare in 750 BC. Homer's purpose in writing the Iliad may have been to create a story about the consequences of challenging the gods. The story may also be a metaphor for the conflict between human civilization and the gods. Some say that the 10-year siege described in the Iliad may not have actually occurred. Most scholars agree that Troy was a real city, and that the Trojan War likely happened. Archaeological evidence from Turkey includes arrowheads, slings, and battle-fallen corpses that date to the time of the Trojan War. There is debate over whether the ruins in Turkey represent the same Troy as the one described in the Iliad. However, if we're talking about a standalone elegy poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, by Thomas Gray, published in 1751, is one of the most famous early examples in English literature. It is considered to be inspired by the poet's observations of a rural churchyard near his home in Stoke Poges, England, and his reflections on the lives of the ordinary people buried there. Essentially, the poem draws on the universal theme of death and the anonymity of the unknown, making it more of a meditation on human mortality than a specific story based on real events. Some say the poem doesn't focus on a particular person or incident, but rather contemplates the lives and deaths of the unknown people buried in the churchyard. Some scholars suggest the death of Gray's friend led him to contemplate themes of mortality. This poem is often considered one of the most famous elegy poems. It reflects on the lives of common people buried in a rural churchyard, contemplating themes of mortality and the inevitability of death. Its poignant, timeless meditation on life and death has resonated deeply with readers for centuries. That it's a powerful piece of poetry that captures a universal human experience. Many consider Adonais, by Percy Bysshe Shelley, to be one of the saddest elegy poems. Written in 1821 to mourn the death of fellow poet John Keats, it captures the profound sorrow and sense of loss Shelley felt for his friend's untimely passing. The poem is a beautiful and heartbreaking tribute, delving into themes of mortality, beauty, and the enduring impact of art. Shelley's grief is palpable throughout, making it an incredibly moving piece. Shelley reflects on the fleeting nature of life and the enduring power of artistic legacy. Several famous elegies draw inspiration from true events, often reflecting on loss, tragedy, and societal issues. Here are a few notable examples. Lycidas, by John Milton, mourns the death of his friend Edward King, who drowned in a shipwreck. It's filled with pastoral imagery and mythological references, expressing a personal loss within the framework of nature's cycles. Lycidas is a poem by John Milton, written in 1637. It first appeared in a 1638 collection of elegies, Justa Eduardo King Naufrago, dedicated to the memory of Edward King, a friend of Milton at Cambridge who drowned when his ship sank in the Irish Sea off the coast of Wales in August 1637. The poem is 193 lines in length and is irregularly rhymed. Many of the other poems in the compilation are in Greek and Latin, but Lycidas is one of the poems written in English. Milton republished the poem in 1645. Sonnet to Chatterton, by John Keats. This elegiac sonnet is one of Keats's first sonnets, but is certainly not his most famous. However, Chatterton greatly influenced Keats in his works, making this an important poem. Keats mourns his young predecessor because he committed suicide at the age of 17 rather than starving to death. Endymion, John Keats. Endymion is a poem by John Keats first published in 1818 by Taylor and Hesse of Fleet Street in London. John Keats dedicated this poem to the late poet Thomas Chatterton. The poem begins with the line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." Endymion is written in rhyming couplets in iambic pentameter, also known as heroic couplets. The Grave of Keats by Oscar Wilde. The Grave of Keats by Oscar Wilde describes the physical state of Keats' grave and the emotional impact that his short life had on England. The poem is composed in the style of a Petrarchan sonnet. It is divided into a set of 8 lines, or an octave, and a set of 6 lines, or sestet. The first section follows along exactly with the structure of an Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, while the last 6 lines are rearranged. This was a common practice in the composition of sonnets as it allowed the poet to stick to a form but still experiment. John Keats met death on the heels of overwhelming grief. In 1818, during the summer, Keats embarked on a walking tour of northern England and Scotland. Over the following year, Keats' brother died of tuberculosis and Keats fell in love with a woman named Fanny Brawne who would have a remarkable impact on his work. In 1819 he contracted tuberculosis and left for Italy where he suffered in agony, partially due to absurd medical treatments, until his death in February of 1821. Throughout his short life, Keats only published 3 volumes of poetry and was read by only a very small number of people. Thyrsis is a poem published in 1866 by 19th-century English poet Matthew Arnold. The poem memorializes and commemorates his friend Arthur Hugh Clough, another English poet, who had been Arnold's close friend at Rugby School and Oxford University. Clough died in Florence, Italy, in 1861. The poem touches on themes of friendship and the passing of time. In Memoriam AHH, by Alfred, Lord Tennyson is an extended elegy for his close friend Arthur Henry Hallam, exploring grief, faith, and the quest for meaning after a significant loss. Written in memory of Tennyson's close friend Arthur Hallam, this poem reflects profound grief and the impact of Hallam's sudden death. It explores themes of loss and mourning. Often found in elegies connected to violent or untimely deaths, the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, this traditional Scottish ballad tells the story of a shipwreck caused by the king's orders. It explores themes of fate and tragedy that resonate with real-life maritime disasters. It is thought that Sir Patrick Spens may reflect an actual 13th-century marine disaster connected with Margaret the Maid of Norway. Certainly, Longfellow's Wreck of the Hesperus, published in 1840, was influenced by at least one, probably 2, incidents from the Great Blizzard of 1839. The Death of the Hired Man, by Robert Frost. This poem contemplates the death of a farmhand who returns home after a life of hardship. While not strictly a specific true event, it touches on themes of abandonment and societal neglect. While this may not be directly about someone, Frost endured a lot of pain in his life. 1894, he is rejected by Eleanor for not having a job, and travels to the Dismal Swamp in Norfolk, VA. He thought of it as the possible place where he might end his life and so mete out the proper punishment to Eleanor, 18, who by that time was immersed in her life at St. Lawrence. This theme of personal discovery through time spent in the wilderness will become a major theme in Frost's work. If Frost can be said to have an archetypal poem, it is one in which the poet sets off, forlorn or despairing, into the wilderness, where he will either lose his soul or find that Gnostic spark of revelation. 1900, Frost's son Eliot dies of typhoid fever at their farm on July 8. Frost blamed himself for not calling a good doctor sooner. It was like murdering his own child, he said. The Ballad of Reading Gaol, by Oscar Wilde, written after Wilde's imprisonment for gross indecency, this poem reflects on the execution of a fellow inmate, exploring themes of justice, suffering, and the human condition in the face of crime and punishment, a satirical elegy on the death of a late famous general, by Jonathan Swift. This poem was written in 1722. In response to the death of John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. Swift, known for his sharp wit, used the poem to critique the general's arrogance and corruption, presenting death as the great equalizer. To the Daisy is an elegy by William Wordsworth about his brother John Wordsworth, who drowned in a shipwreck in 1805. Oh, Captain! My Captain, by Walt Whitman. This poem is an elegy for President Abraham Lincoln, written after his assassination. Droppa, an elegy for a murdered woman by Gerard Kristni, a poet from Iceland. In fact, the story told in Droppa is based on real events that Gerard came across in her work as a journalist writing about crime. There was a young woman who was murdered by her husband in their attic apartment in downtown Reykjavik. At the time, he was still living in the same attic apartment. Eventually, he too was murdered there, many years later. Death Fugue, a famous poem by Paul Celan, a German-speaking poet born in Romania, that memorializes victims of the Holocaust. Wounds, an elegy by Michael Longley that memorializes victims of the Northern Irish Troubles. The Man with Night Sweats, a collection of poems by Tom Gunn that addresses deaths related to AIDS in the 1980s. Requiem, a poem by Akhmatova that memorializes the suffering of the Soviet Union under Stalin's purges. The Raven, by Edgar Allan Poe. This poem reflects themes of loss and madness following a tragic event, with dark undertones that could be linked to crime and despair. Not true, or is it? Lenore is not based on a real person. However, some say that the character may be loosely based on Poe's wife, Virginia, who was ill at the time Poe wrote the poem. Literary experts speculate that the talking raven from Barnaby Rudge inspired The Raven. To an Athlete Dying Young, by A.E. Housman. Although it focuses on the untimely death of a young athlete, it addresses themes of loss and the fleeting nature of fame. Resonating with the impact of societal pressures, The Soldier's Funeral, by John Brown. This poem serves as a reflection on the death of soldiers, often linked to the harsh realities of war and its consequences, which can include themes of crime against humanity. The Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, a traditional ballad about a tragic shipwreck. It captures the sorrow of loss and the inevitability of fate. The Waste Land, by T.S. Eliot. While not a traditional elegy, this modernist poem evokes a sense of loss and despair in the post-World War I landscape, addressing themes of death and disillusionment. When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, by Walt Whitman. This elegy for Abraham Lincoln explores themes of mourning and the cycle of life and death, using rich imagery of nature to express grief. Funeral Blues, by W.H. Auden, a poignant elegy that captures the sorrow of losing someone. The poem famously opens with the lines, "Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone." Funeral Blues, by W.H. Auden was written as a powerful expression of deep grief and despair following the death of a loved one. With the poem's imagery and language conveying a sense of the world seemingly stopping and losing its meaning in the face of such loss, it is considered an elegy, meant to mourn and memorialize the deceased. The poem was 5 stanzas long when it first appeared in the 1936 verse play The Ascent of F6, written by Auden and Christopher Isherwood. It was written as a satiric poem of mourning for a political leader. In the play, the poem was put to music by the composer Benjamin Britten and read as a blues work. Hedley Anderson, an English singer, was a lead performer in The Ascent of F6. The Grave of Keats, by Oscar Wilde. Rid of the world's injustice and his pain, he rests at last beneath God's veil of blue, taken from life when life and love were new. The youngest of the martyrs here is lain, fair as Sebastian, and as early slain. No cypress shades his grave, no funeral yew, but gentle violets weeping with the dew weave on his bones an ever-blossoming chain. O proudest heart that broke for misery! O sweetest lips since those of Mitylene! O poet-painter of our English land! Thy name was writ in water, it shall stand, and tears like mine will keep thy memory green, as Isabella did her basil tree. Sonnet to Chatterton, by John Keats. O Chatterton! How very sad thy fate, dear child of sorrow, son of misery! How soon the film of death obscured that eye, whence genius mildly falshed, and high debate, how soon that voice, majestic and elate, melted in dying numbers. Oh, How nigh was night to thy fair morning? Thou didst die, a half-blown floweret which cold blasts a maudie, but this is past. Thou art among the stars, of highest heaven, to the rolling spheres, thou sweetly singest, not thy hymning Mars, above the ingrate world and human fears. On earth the good man base detraction bars, from thy fair name, and waters it with tears, O Captain. My Captain, by Walt Whitman Dash. O Captain. My Captain. Our fearful trip is done, the ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won, the port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring, but oh heart. Heart. Heart, oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead, O Captain. My Captain. Rise up and hear the bells, rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills, for you bouquets and ribboned wreaths, for you the shores a-crowding, for you they call, the swaying mass, their eager faces turning, here Captain. Dear Father, this arm beneath your head, it is some dream that on the deck. You fallen cold and dead, my Captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still, my Father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse nor will, the ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done, from fearful trip the victor ship comes in with object won, exult O shores, and ring O bells, but I with mournful tread, walk the deck my Captain lies, fallen cold and dead. To the Daisy, by William Wordsworth, with little here to do or see, of things that in the great world be, Daisy. Again I talk to thee, for thou art worthy, thou unassuming commonplace, of nature, with that homely face, and yet with something of a grace, which love makes for thee. Oft on the dappled turf at ease, I sit and play with similes, loose types of things through all degrees, thoughts of thy raising, and many a fond and idle name, I give to thee, for praise or blame, as is the humor of the game, while I am gazing, a nun demure of lowly port, or sprightly maiden, of love's court, in thy simplicity the sport, of all temptations, a queen in crown of rubies dress. A starveling in a scanty vest, are all, as seems to suit thee best, thy appellations, a little cyclops with one eye, staring to threaten and defy, that thought comes next and instantly, the freak is over, the shape will vanish and behold, a silver shield with boss of gold, that spreads itself, some fairy bold, in fight to cover, I see thee glittering from afar, and then thou art a pretty star, not quite so fair as many are, in heaven above thee, yet like a star, with glittering crest, self-poised in air thou seemst to rest, may peace come never to his nest, who shall reprove thee, bright flower? For by that name at last, when all my reveries are past, I call thee, and to that cleave fast, sweet silent creature, that breath'st with me in sun and air, do thou, as thou art wont, repair my heart with gladness, and a share of thy meek nature.